In a quiet town called Willow Creek, where old wooden houses stood beside narrow streets, there lived an 8-year-old boy named Eli Carter. Eli was small for his age, with dark brown hair, gentle eyes, and a smile that appeared even when life gave him very little reason to smile. He lived with his father, Daniel, and his mother, Rose, in a tiny rented house at the edge of town. Their home had 2 small bedrooms, an old kitchen, and a porch that creaked whenever the wind blew. They were poor, but Eli never thought of himself as unhappy. His father worked long hours doing whatever jobs he could find. Some days he repaired fences. Other days he carried boxes at the grocery store or fixed broken roofs. He always came home tired, but whenever Eli ran toward him, Daniel would kneel down and open his arms. "How was your day, little man?" he would ask. Eli would smile and say, "Better now." Those 4 words always made his father laugh. At night, Daniel sometimes sat beside Eli's bed and told him that being poor was not something to be ashamed of. "Money can make life easier," he would say softly, "but it can never decide what kind of person you become." Eli remembered those words. Then, one cold November evening, everything changed. Daniel had gone to work on a construction site outside town. A storm had been moving in, and Rose kept looking through the window waiting for him. He never came home. The next morning, 2 men from the construction company arrived at their door. Eli watched his mother's face change as she listened. She slowly sat down on the kitchen floor. Eli didn't understand at first. Then he heard his father's name, and he heard the words "accident" and "didn't make it." The house became silent, a silence deeper than anything Eli had ever known. His mother held him tightly, crying into his hair. Eli didn't cry. He simply stared at his father's old work boots beside the door. Those boots were still covered in dried mud. For the first time, Eli understood that his father was never going to wear them again. The funeral was small. There was no money for flowers, so a few neighbors brought them from their own gardens. After everyone left, Eli stood beside his mother's bed and watched her stare at the ceiling. She had not eaten all day. Bills were scattered across the kitchen table. Rent, electricity, groceries. Everything suddenly looked frightening. Eli walked quietly to the table and picked up one of the bills. He couldn't understand all the numbers, but he understood one thing. His father was gone, and someone had to take care of Mom. That night, Eli opened his father's old wooden toolbox. Inside were a hammer, a measuring tape, a few screwdrivers, and a pair of worn work gloves. 3 days after Daniel's funeral, the little house on Maple Street felt different. Eli still expected to hear his father's boots scraping across the porch. Sometimes late at night, he thought he could hear Daniel's voice calling his name. But every morning brought the same painful truth. Dad was gone. Rose tried to be strong for Eli, but she had trouble finding work. She had spent years caring for the family and had never had a steady job outside the home. Now she spent hours filling out applications, only to come home with the same tired expression. One afternoon, Eli noticed something on the kitchen table. The last $20 bill they had. Rose counted it twice. "We'll make it last," she whispered. Eli looked at the nearly empty refrigerator. There was half a carton of milk, 3 eggs, and a little bread. He remembered his father's words. Money can make life easier, but it can never decide what kind of person you become. That evening, Eli walked to the small grocery store near their neighborhood. He stood outside for several minutes, watching people carry bags to their cars. Then he noticed something. An elderly man was struggling to carry several boxes from his truck. Eli ran over. "Sir, can I help you?" The man looked surprised. "You're a little young to be carrying boxes." "I'm strong," Eli said. The man smiled. "Are you sure?" Eli nodded. Together they carried the boxes inside. When they finished, the man reached into his pocket and pulled out $1. "Here." Eli stared at it. A single dollar. It seemed strangely large in his small hand. "I can't take it," he said. "You earned it." Eli looked at the dollar again. Then he remembered the empty refrigerator. He accepted it. "Thank you." On the walk home, Eli held the dollar tightly inside his fist. It was his first money, not money he had found. Not money his mother had given him. Money he had earned. When he entered the house, Rose was washing dishes. Eli quietly placed the dollar on the table. She turned around. "Where did you get that?" "I helped someone." Rose stared at him. You went somewhere alone? Eli lowered his eyes. I just carried some boxes. His mother immediately knelt beside him. Eli, you are 8 years old. I know. You shouldn't have to worry about money. But you do. Rose became silent. Eli looked at her with tears in his eyes. I don't want you to be scared anymore, Mom. Rose pulled him into her arms. For a long time, neither of them spoke. That night, Rose placed the dollar beside Daniel's old toolbox. She didn't spend it. She couldn't. It was the first proof that, even in their darkest moment, Eli was trying to help. The next morning, Eli woke before the sun came up. For a few seconds, he forgot about everything. He looked toward the doorway, expecting to see his father standing there with a cup of coffee in his hand. Then the memory returned. Eli quietly got dressed. On the porch sat an old red wagon that belonged to his father. One wheel was crooked and the paint had faded from years of use. Eli remembered Daniel pulling it behind him whenever he brought home firewood. He dragged the wagon into the backyard and examined the broken wheel. He had no idea how to fix it. But his father had always said, if you don't know how, learn. So Eli opened the toolbox. He tried tightening the wheel with a wrench. It fell off. He tried again. The screw slipped from his fingers. He tried a third time. This time the wheel stayed. Eli smiled. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. After breakfast, Eli walked through the neighborhood, pulling the wagon behind him. He stopped at houses and asked politely, do you have anything I can carry away for you? At first, people were confused. Then Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman who lived 3 houses away, called him over. I have some fallen branches in my yard, she said. Could you help me? Eli nodded. He spent nearly an hour collecting branches and putting them into the wagon. When he finished, Mrs. Henderson handed him $3. Eli stared at the money. That's too much. She smiled. Your father used to help me with things like this. Eli's smile disappeared for a moment. You knew my dad? Everyone knew Daniel. She touched his shoulder gently. He never walked past someone who needed help. Eli looked down at the $3. I want to be like him. You already are. Those words stayed with him. By the end of the afternoon, Eli had earned $7. It wasn't much. But when he came home, he placed every dollar on the kitchen table. Rose looked at him with worried eyes. Eli, you can't keep doing this every day. I can help. You should be playing with children your age. Eli looked toward his father's toolbox. I'll play later. Rose sat beside him. You're still a little boy. I know. His voice became softer. But you're my mom. Rose's eyes filled with tears. Eli continued. Dad took care of us. Now he's gone. I just want to help you until things get better. Rose hugged him so tightly that Eli could barely breathe. She didn't want her son to grow up too quickly, but she also knew that something had changed inside him. December arrived quietly in Willow Creek. Snow began falling before Christmas, covering the rooftops, trees, and narrow streets in a soft white blanket. For most children, winter meant warm blankets, hot chocolate, and afternoons spent building snowmen. For Eli, it meant more work. The cold made his little red wagon harder to pull. Its wheels sometimes became stuck in the snow, and his fingers often turned red beneath his father's old gloves. Still, every morning Eli went outside. He shoveled sidewalks. He carried groceries. He stacked firewood. He helped older neighbors clear snow from their porches. Some days he earned $10. Other days only $3. But he never came home empty-handed. One morning, Eli found a small envelope beneath the door. It was an electricity bill. Rose opened it and stared at the amount. Her face became pale. We have to pay this by Friday, she whispered. Eli looked at the number. He couldn't fully understand it. But he understood his mother's silence. That evening, Rose sat at the kitchen table with her head in her hands. Eli quietly walked outside. Snow was falling again. He looked at his father's old red wagon. Then he looked at the darkening sky. I can do more, he whispered. The next morning, he made a simple handwritten sign. Snow shoveling, small jobs, fair price. He placed it beside his wagon. Then he went door to door. At first, nobody answered. Then Mr. Harris, who owned a small hardware store, opened his door. You're taking snow jobs now? Eli nodded. How much? Whatever you think is fair. Mr. Harris looked at the boy for a moment. Then he handed him a shovel. Start with my sidewalk. Eli worked for almost 2 hours. The snow was heavy and his arms hurt. When he finished, Mr. Harris gave him $15. Eli smiled. "Thank you." But Mr. Harris shook his head. "You earned it." Word spread quickly. By afternoon, people were calling for Eli. He worked until his shoes were soaked and his back ached. When he finally returned home, he placed $38 on the table. Rose stared at the money. Then she stared at her son. "You did all this today?" Eli nodded. "I think we can pay the bill." Rose covered her face. Eli became frightened. "Mom?" She lowered her hands. She was crying. But this time they were not tears of despair. They were tears of love. She pulled Eli close. "You shouldn't have to carry this much." Eli rested his head against her shoulder. "I know. I do you want your remarks." By January, almost everyone in Willow Creek knew Eli. People knew the little boy with the red wagon. They knew he arrived early, worked quietly, and never complained about the cold. But Eli still had one rule. He would never ask for more than he had earned. One Saturday morning, Eli was walking past an old blue house when he heard a loud crack. He turned around. A section of the front porch had collapsed. An elderly woman stood beside the doorway looking frightened. Eli recognized her. Her name was Mrs. Bennett. "My porch," she whispered. Eli walked closer. "Are you okay?" "Yes," she said. "But I can't afford to repair it." Eli looked at the broken boards. He remembered his father's toolbox. "I can try." Mrs. Bennett smiled sadly. "You're just a little boy." "I know." Eli picked up one of the loose boards. "But my dad taught me some things." He spent the rest of the morning studying the porch. He didn't know enough to repair everything. So he went to Mr. Harris. The hardware store owner listened carefully. Then he followed Eli back to the house. Together they examined the damage. "You were right," Mr. Harris said. "It needs to be rebuilt." Eli looked worried. "How much will it cost?" Mr. Harris gave him a number. Eli's heart sank. He didn't have nearly enough. That evening he returned home quietly. Rose noticed his expression. "What happened?" Eli told her. She listened. "You don't have to fix everyone's problems." "I know." "Then why are you upset?" Eli looked down. "Because she has nobody." Rose was silent. Then she smiled. "Your father would have understood." The next morning Eli made a decision. He would not do the job alone. He went door to door asking people if they had leftover wood, nails, or anything they could donate. At first he received only a few pieces. Then something changed. One neighbor brought lumber. Another brought paint. Someone else brought nails. A retired carpenter offered his time. By the end of the week, half the town seemed to know about Mrs. Bennett's porch. Eli watched as people worked together. He carried small boards. He held measuring tape. He passed tools. He listened carefully. 3 days later, the porch was finished. It was simple, but it was strong. Mrs. Bennett stepped outside slowly. She looked around. Then she began to cry. "I haven't had a safe place to sit outside since my husband died." She touched Eli's head. "Thank you." Eli smiled. By the beginning of February, Eli's story had traveled farther than he ever imagined. The newspaper article about the little boy with the red wagon had been shared by people in nearby towns. Some called him brave. Others called him inspiring. Eli didn't think he was either. He was simply doing what he believed his father would have done. One cold afternoon, a white envelope arrived at their house. Rose found it in the mailbox. There was no return address. She opened it carefully. Inside was a letter. "Dear Eli, I read about you in the newspaper. I don't know you, but your story reminded me of someone I once knew. My father used to say that the strongest people are not always the ones with the most money. They are the ones who keep helping others when they have almost nothing themselves. I would like to meet you. Please come to the Willow Creek Community Workshop next Saturday. There is something there that belonged to your father." Eli read the last sentence again. Something that belonged to Dad? He looked at his mother. What could it be? Rose didn't know. Neither of them slept well that night. The following Saturday, Eli and Rose walked to the community workshop. It was an old brick building near the center of town. Inside, several people were waiting. Among them was a tall woman named Margaret Lewis. She introduced herself as the director of the workshop. "I knew your father," she said. Eli froze. "You did?" Margaret nodded. "Daniel volunteered here years ago." She led them toward a wooden cabinet. Inside was an old collection of tools. Eli recognized them immediately. His father's hammer, his father's measuring tape, his father's old square. Eli reached toward them but stopped. "Why are they here?" Margaret smiled sadly. "Your father helped build this workshop when it first opened." Eli stared at the tools. "I thought those were lost." "They weren't." Margaret handed him a small wooden box. "Your father left this here." Eli opened it. Inside was a folded piece of paper. His hands began to shake. He recognized his father's handwriting. "For my little man." Eli unfolded the paper. The message was short. "If you're reading this someday, I hope you remember one thing. You don't need to become rich to have a meaningful life." By early spring, the small community workshop had changed. Every Saturday morning, children from Willow Creek arrived with gloves, lunch bags, and curious smiles. At the center of it all was Eli. He was still only 8 years old, but Margaret trusted him with small responsibilities. Eli never pretended to know everything. When he didn't understand something, he asked. When he made a mistake, he tried again. And when another child became frustrated, he always said the same thing. "It's okay." Dad used to say that learning takes time. Soon, the children began helping elderly neighbors with simple jobs. They fixed loose fence boards. They painted porch steps. They carried groceries. They cleaned small yards. They repaired broken chairs and tables. The work wasn't perfect, but it mattered. One Saturday, a little girl named Sophie joined the group. She was only 7 and was nervous around the others. "I can't use tools," she whispered. Eli handed her a screwdriver. Neither could I at first. Sophie looked at him. "You learned?" Eli smiled. "My dad taught me to try." She carefully tightened a screw on an old wooden chair. When it held, her face lit up. "I did it." Eli laughed. "Yes, you did." Margaret watched them from across the room. She had started the workshop to help families. She never expected it to become a place where children learned courage. But Eli's own life was still difficult. Rose had finally found part-time work at a local bakery, but their money remained tight. Some nights, Eli pretended he wasn't hungry, so his mother could have the last piece of bread. Rose always noticed. One evening, she placed half the bread back on his plate. "You need it." Eli shook his head. "You worked today. So did you." They looked at each other. Then they laughed quietly. Their life wasn't easy, but it was no longer hopeless. One afternoon, Mr. Harris came to the workshop carrying a large wooden sign. He placed it on the table. "What is that?" Eli asked. Mr. Harris smiled. "You'll find out." The children gathered around as he turned the sign over. Painted across the front were the words, "The Daniel Carter Community Repair Project." Eli stopped breathing for a moment. "My dad?" Mr. Harris nodded. "People in this town wanted to honor him." Eli touched the letters carefully. "But why?" Margaret answered. "Because your father spent years helping people." Without expecting anything in return, Eli looked around the room. The news hit Eli harder than he expected. Rose had lost her job. The bakery had reduced its staff, and she was one of the people they could no longer afford to keep. That evening, she sat quietly at the kitchen table. There was no anger in her face, only exhaustion. Eli opened the cupboard. There was almost nothing inside. A little rice, some flour, 2 cans of beans. He closed the door. "How long can we manage?" he asked. Rose tried to smile. "We'll figure something out." But Eli knew she was frightened. That night, he couldn't sleep. He walked outside and sat on the porch. The town was quiet beneath the moonlight. His father's old red wagon rested beside the steps. Eli looked at it for a long time. "I don't know what to do now," he whispered. For the first time since his father's death, Eli felt completely helpless. The next morning, he went to the workshop. Margaret immediately noticed something was wrong. "What happened?" Eli told her. She listened without interrupting. Then she said, "You don't have to solve everything alone." "I know." But Eli's eyes filled with tears. "I just want Mom to stop worrying." Margaret hugged him. "You've already done more than most adults would." Eli shook his head. "Not enough." Margaret gently lifted his chin. "Eli, helping your family doesn't mean carrying the entire world on your shoulders." He didn't answer. That afternoon, something unexpected happened. A local farmer named Samuel arrived at the workshop. He had read the newspaper article months earlier and had heard about Eli's repair project. "I have an old greenhouse," Samuel said. "It's been sitting unused for years." Eli looked curious. "What does that have to do with us?" Samuel smiled. "I need someone to help me bring it back to life." He explained that the greenhouse could grow vegetables throughout the year. If Eli and the other volunteers helped repair it, Samuel would give part of the harvest to families who needed food. Eli's eyes brightened. "Could my mom help?" "Of course." For the first time in days, Rose smiled. The work began the following morning. They cleaned broken windows, repaired wooden frames, cleared weeds, fixed the doors. It took weeks. Eli worked after school and every weekend. Rose helped whenever she could. The children from the workshop joined them. Even Mr. Harris brought tools. Slowly, the abandoned greenhouse changed. Tiny green leaves appeared. Then flowers. Then rows of vegetables. One evening, Eli stood inside the warm greenhouse while rain tapped gently against the glass roof. He looked around. Something beautiful had grown from something forgotten. He thought about his own life. His father had died. His mother had lost her job. They had almost lost their home. Yet somehow every broken thing had led them toward something new. Eli smiled. Maybe broken didn't always mean finished. Maybe broken things could become something stronger. Spring had finally arrived in Willow Creek. The snow disappeared from the sidewalks. Flowers returned to the gardens. And the old trees began filling with green leaves. For Eli, life was slowly becoming brighter. The community repair project was growing. The greenhouse was producing more vegetables than anyone expected. Rose had started working with Samuel at the greenhouse, helping organize the weekly food deliveries, and Eli still pulled his little red wagon through town. But something had changed. People no longer saw him as the poor little boy who needed help. They saw him as someone who helped others. One afternoon, Margaret asked Eli to come to the workshop. "There is someone here to see you." Eli walked inside. A woman in a gray coat stood near the workbench. She introduced herself as Claire Morgan. "I work for a national foundation that supports children with unusual community projects." Eli looked confused. "Why are you here?" Claire smiled. "We heard about the repair project." She explained that someone had sent them the newspaper article about Eli. Then she showed him a letter. The foundation wanted to offer Eli a scholarship. Not money for his family, something bigger. They would pay for his education through high school and college if Eli wanted it. Eli didn't speak. He simply stared at the letter. "Why me?" Claire answered gently. "Because you didn't wait for someone to save you. You started helping people with what you had." Eli looked toward his father's old tools. "I just wanted to help Mom. And that's exactly why people noticed you." Eli took the letter home. Rose read it twice. Then she began crying. "Mom?" She hugged him. "Your dad would be so proud." Eli smiled. "But I don't want to leave Willow Creek." "You don't have to." The scholarship allowed him to remain close to home. Eli could continue his education while helping at the workshop. For the first time, he began imagining a future. Not a future where he was simply surviving. A future where he could build things, learn engineering, design affordable tools, create small businesses for families who had nothing. That night, Eli opened his father's old wooden box. At the bottom, beneath the tools, he found another folded paper. 10 years passed quietly in Willow Creek. The little boy with the red wagon was no longer a little boy. Eli Carter was 18 now. He had grown taller, stronger, and more confident, but he still carried the same gentle heart. The community workshop had grown into a real organization. The greenhouse had become a small network of gardens. Families who once needed help were now growing food and helping others. And the Daniel Carter Community Repair Project had expanded into 3 nearby towns. Eli had studied engineering through his scholarship. But whenever he returned home, he still worked with his hands. He believed his father would have wanted it that way. One warm summer evening, Eli stood outside the original workshop. The old red wagon sat beside the doorway. Its paint was faded. Its wheels had been replaced twice. But Eli refused to throw it away. A young boy walked up to him. "Mr. Carter?" Eli smiled. "Just Eli." The boy pointed at the wagon. "Did you really use that to work when you were little?" Eli nodded. "I did." "Why?" Eli looked at the wagon.
"Because I needed a way to help my family."
The boy thought for a moment. "Were you scared?" Eli smiled softly. Every day? Then why didn't you stop? Eli looked toward the workshop. Because someone needed me. The boy nodded as if he understood. Then Eli noticed something in his hands. It was a small envelope. What is that? The boy handed it to him. Inside was a drawing. It showed a little house, a red wagon, and a man standing beside a boy. Underneath were the words, "Thank you for helping people like us." Eli's eyes filled with tears. He turned toward the sky. For a moment he imagined his father's voice. "How was your day, little man?" Eli whispered. "Better now, Dad." That evening he visited his mother's house. Rose was sitting on the porch. She looked at her son and smiled. "You've grown." Eli laughed. "You say that every time." "Because it's true." They sat together quietly. After a while, Eli placed an old wooden box on the table. Inside were his father's tools. The hammer, the measuring tape, the screwdriver, and the original work gloves. Rose touched them gently. "Do you still miss him?" Eli looked toward the sunset. "Every day." "Me too. But I don't feel angry anymore." Rose looked at him. "Why?" Eli smiled. "Because Dad didn't leave us with nothing." He opened the box. "He left us a way to keep going." Years earlier, an 8-year-old boy had believed that earning money was the only way to save his family. He had been wrong. Money helped. Work helped. Education helped. But what truly changed their lives was kindness. One small act had inspired another. One neighbor had helped Eli. Eli had helped another neighbor. That neighbor had inspired someone else. And slowly, one little boy's determination had become a community. Eli never became famous for being rich. He became known for something better. He became the man who showed people that even the smallest hands could build something meaningful. Before leaving the porch that night, Eli looked at the old red wagon one final time. He placed his father's work gloves inside it. Then he smiled. "I'm still trying, Dad." The evening breeze moved through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, children laughed. The workshop lights glowed warmly, and Willow Creek continued becoming the kind of town Eli's father had always believed it could be. A place where people helped one another. A place where broken things could be repaired. A place where no one had to struggle alone. And perhaps that was the greatest thing Eli ever earned. Not money, not success, not recognition, but a life that carried his father's kindness forward. Because sometimes the greatest inheritance a child can receive isn't something left in a bank account. Sometimes it is a lesson. Sometimes it is a pair of worn-out work gloves. And sometimes it is the courage to keep helping others long after the person who taught you how is gone. Eli looked toward the stars one last time. Then he whispered, "Thank you for teaching me how to stay." And with that, the little boy who once carried his family's worries on his tiny shoulders finally understood something. He had never been carrying the world. He had been carrying love. And love, when passed from one heart to another, can become strong enough to change an entire town. The end.